The thunderous hooves of wild mustangs echoed across the Montana plains as Forrest Caldwell raised his weathered hand to shield his eyes from the setting sun, unaware that fate was galloping toward him just as swiftly as those untamed horses disappeared over the horizon. Montana Territory, 1878. Forrest wiped the sweat from his brow and continued mending the fence along his property. At 32, he had carved out a respectable homestead for himself, a sturdy cabin, a well-built barn, and enough grazing land to support his modest herd of cattle. 6 years of solitude had hardened him, but beneath the leathery exterior beat a heart that remembered tenderness, even if those memories were growing more distant with each passing season. The land around him was beginning to soften with spring's touch. April had brought the first wildflowers, painting the prairie with splashes of color after a harsh winter. Forrest took pride in his independence, in the life he had built with his own 2 hands after leaving his family's failing farm in Missouri. Out here, a man answered to no one but himself and the elements. He hammered the last post into place just as the sky transformed into a watercolor of oranges and purples. His faithful border collie, Rusty, had been watching from the shade of a nearby cottonwood tree and now trotted over, ears perked. "What is it, boy?" Forrest asked, following the dog's gaze toward the eastern horizon. At first it was just a speck, but as it drew closer, Forrest could make out a horse pulling a small wagon. The animal moved with the labored gait of exhaustion, and the wagon swayed dangerously with each step. Forrest squinted. Something wasn't right. The horse had no driver guiding it, the reins hung loose. Yet it continued toward his property as if drawn by instinct or desperation. "Come on, Rusty," he said, striding toward the approaching wagon. When he reached it, what he found made his breath catch. A woman lay slumped over in the wagon seat, her face pallid, clothes dusty from travel. Her dark blonde hair had mostly escaped from its pins, falling around her shoulders in tangled waves. The horse, a chestnut mare with foam-flecked flanks, had clearly been pushing on for miles beyond exhaustion. "Madam," Forrest called, reaching up to touch her shoulder gently. "Madam, can you hear me?" The woman stirred slightly, eyelids fluttering to reveal eyes the color of prairie sage. They focused on him for just a moment before rolling back as she slumped forward. Forrest caught her before she could fall from the wagon. Without hesitation, he lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, her body radiating a concerning heat through her simple dress. Fever, he realized, and a bad one at that. "Rusty, stay with the horse," he commanded, carrying the unconscious woman toward his cabin. Inside, he placed her carefully on his bed, then hurried to fetch water and a clean cloth. As he bathed her forehead, he took proper stock of her. She was young, perhaps mid-20s, with delicate features now flushed with fever. A simple gold band adorned her left hand. Married then, or had been, her dress, though dusty from travel, was well made if modest. A small leather bag had been clutched in her hand, which now lay beside her on the bed. Forrest wouldn't open it, that wasn't his way, but he wondered what circumstances had driven this woman to travel alone across dangerous territory in such a state. The woman moaned, her head turning restlessly on the pillow. "Easy now," Forrest said softly. "You're safe here." After ensuring she was as comfortable as possible, he went back outside to tend to her horse and wagon. The poor beast was nearly dead on its feet. He unhitched it, led it to water, and gave it a generous portion of oats before turning it into the corral with his own horses. In the wagon, he found a small trunk containing women's clothing, a framed photograph of a stern-looking man in a military uniform, a Bible, and little else. Night had fallen completely by the time he returned to the cabin. The woman remained unconscious, but her breathing seemed steadier. Forrest settled into his chair by the fireplace, prepared for a long night of watching over his unexpected guest. It was nearly dawn when she finally stirred. Forrest, who had dozed off in his chair, woke instantly when he heard her gasp. "Where?" Her voice broke, dry and raspy. Forrest quickly poured a cup of water from the pitcher beside the bed and held it to her lips. "Easy now," he said. "You're at my homestead about 20 miles west of Fort Benton. I found you passed out in your wagon yesterday evening. You've got yourself quite a fever." She took small sips, her eyes clearer now, though still glazed with illness never leaving his face. "Thank you," she whispered when she'd had enough. "I'm Nora Flanagan, Forrest Caldwell," he replied with a slight nod. "What brings you out here alone, Mrs. Flanagan? It's dangerous country for a woman traveling by herself." A shadow passed over her face. "I had nowhere else to go." She tried to sit up but fell back with a wince. "Best not to move too much," Forrest advised. "That fever needs breaking before you go anywhere." "I can't impose. You're not imposing if you're invited," he said firmly, "and you're in no condition to travel. Your horse is just as worn out as you are." Nora looked as though she might argue further, but exhaustion claimed her again, her eyelids fluttering closed. For 3 days, Forrest tended to Nora as her fever raged. He brewed willow bark tea, applied cool compresses, and spooned broth into her mouth when she was lucid enough to swallow. In her delirium, she sometimes called out names James, mostly, and occasionally Benjamin. She wept in her sleep, apologizing for failures Forrest couldn't understand. On the morning of the 4th day, he woke to find her sitting up in bed, the fever finally broken. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating her face. Without the flush of illness, her complexion was fair, with a light dusting of freckles across her nose. Her hair, which Forrest had awkwardly attempted to comb free of tangles, hung in a simple braid over one shoulder. "Good morning," she said, her voice stronger than it had been. Forrest, who had been sleeping on a bedroll by the fireplace, sat up quickly. "Morning, you're looking better." "Thanks to your care." She glanced around the cabin, taking in the simple but tidy furnishings. "You've been very kind, Mr. Caldwell. Forrest, please." "Forrest," she repeated, offering a small smile. "I'm afraid I've put you out of your bed." He waved away her concern. "I've slept in worse places." He stood and moved to the stove. "Think you could manage some eggs this morning? You need to get your strength back." "That would be wonderful, thank you." As he prepared breakfast, Nora told him her story in measured, careful words. She'd been married to James Flanagan, a cavalry officer stationed at Fort Shaw. 6 months ago, he'd been killed in a skirmish with a band of Blackfoot warriors. "The army provided for me at first," she explained, watching as Forrest placed a plate of eggs and bacon before her. "But when the new commander arrived, he made it clear that resources were limited. I was expected to return east to my family." Her jaw tightened slightly. "I have no family left there. My parents died of fever when I was 18. There was nothing for me. So you decided to head west instead?" Forrest asked, sitting across from her with his own plate. Nora nodded. "I heard there were opportunities in Helena. A friend of James had written that they needed teachers, and I taught school before I married, I thought." She trailed off, looking down at her hands. "I thought I could start fresh." "What happened?" "Bandits," she said simply. 3 days ago, they took nearly everything I had: money, food, my husband's pocket watch. I managed to hide my wedding ring and the photograph, but little else." She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. "I haven't eaten in 2 days. I think that's why the fever took hold so strongly." Forrest felt a surge of anger at the nameless men who had left this woman to die on the trail. "You're welcome to stay here until you're fully recovered," he said. "I can't impose on your kindness indefinitely. It's not imposing," he insisted. "Besides, Helena's still more than 100 miles from here. You need time to regain your strength before attempting that journey." Nora looked as though she might protest further, but instead she simply nodded. "Thank you, Forrest. I'll find a way to repay your kindness." "No need for that," he said gruffly, suddenly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Just focus on getting well." In the days that followed, Nora's strength gradually returned. By the end of the week, she insisted on helping with chores around the cabin. Forrest discovered she was a capable cook and surprisingly knowledgeable about medicinal herbs, skills she attributed to her mother's teachings. "This land reminds me of the stories my father used to tell," she said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. "He always dreamed of coming west, but my mother was too afraid of the wilderness." "It can be harsh," Forrest acknowledged. "But there's a freedom here you won't find back east." Nora nodded, her eyes distant. James felt that way too. It's why he requested the posting at Fort Shaw. He wanted to carve out our own piece of this country. Her voice softened. We were going to build a home after his commission ended. Forrest glanced at her profile, noticing the stubborn set of her jaw beneath the sorrow. You still could, he said cautiously. Land's there for the taking if you've got the will for it. She turned to him with a sad smile. A woman alone doesn't stand much chance out here, as I've already discovered. Forrest couldn't argue with that truth. The territories were unforgiving to men and downright hostile to women without protection. He'd seen it too many times, widows forced to sell everything, take whatever charity was offered, or marry the first man who asked, regardless of his character. Well, you've got time to figure things out, he said finally. No need to rush off until you're ready. 2 weeks stretched into a month. Spring blossomed fully across the prairie, bringing carpets of wildflowers and thunderstorms that rattled the cabin's windows. Nora's presence changed Forrest's home in subtle ways. Curtains appeared at the windows, crafted from fabric she found in her trunk. The scent of baking bread became a regular comfort. Wildflowers stood in jars on the table. Forrest found himself looking forward to returning to the cabin after a day's work. For 6 years, he'd eaten alone, worked alone, lived alone. Now, someone waited for his return, asked about his day, shared meals and conversation. It was unsettling how quickly he'd grown accustomed to her presence. Nora, too, seemed to find comfort in their routine. She no longer spoke of leaving for Helena, though Forrest knew the thought must still be in her mind. The teaching position, if it had existed, was likely filled by now. One evening in late May, they sat shelling peas from Forrest's small garden. Rusty lay at Nora's feet, having transferred his loyalty with shameless ease. I received a letter today, Forrest said, breaking the comfortable silence. From the land office in Fort Benton. Nora looked up, her fingers pausing in their work. Oh. They've approved my claim for the additional 80 acres to the north. He kept his tone casual, though the news represented years of effort. Good grazing land means I can expand the herd come fall. That's wonderful news, Forrest. Her smile was genuine, her eyes crinkling at the corners. You should celebrate, he shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. Thought maybe we could ride into town Saturday, have dinner at the hotel. They do a decent steak. It was the closest thing to a social invitation he'd offered since her arrival. They'd settled into a comfortable domesticity, but both had carefully maintained certain boundaries. Forrest slept on a bedroll in the main room, leaving his bedroom to Nora. They shared meals and conversation, but rarely touched, even accidentally. Nora's cheeks colored slightly. I'd like that, she said, but I'm afraid I don't have anything suitable to wear for such an occasion. Forrest hadn't considered that. We could stop at the mercantile first, he suggested. Get you whatever you need. She shook her head firmly. You've already done too much. I can't accept more charity. It's not charity, he said, frustration edging his voice. Can't a friend buy another friend a dress for a celebration? Is that what we are, friends? Nora asked quietly, her eyes meeting his. The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Forrest realized with sudden clarity that friends didn't begin to encompass what Nora had come to mean to him. I'd like to think so, he said carefully, unless you'd prefer otherwise. Nora studied him for a long moment, then smiled softly. Friends, then. And yes, I'll accompany you to town on Saturday. Saturday dawned clear and warm. Forrest hitched his best horses to the wagon and wore his one good shirt, a blue cotton affair that he usually saved for Christmas or funerals. Nora emerged from the cabin wearing her simplest dress, freshly washed and pressed, her hair neatly arranged. You look nice, Forrest said, the words feeling awkward in his mouth. Compliments weren't his strong suit. Thank you, she replied, a slight blush coloring her cheeks as he helped her into the wagon. The 15-mile journey to river crossing passed pleasantly. The small settlement had sprung up where the stage route crossed Elk Creek, consisting of a mercantile, a hotel with a decent restaurant, a livery stable, and a handful of other businesses. It wasn't much compared to Fort Benton or Helena, but it served the needs of the scattered homesteaders and ranchers in the area. Their first stop was the mercantile, where Mrs. Patterson, the owner's wife, took Nora under her wing with obvious delight. "It's so wonderful to finally meet you, my dear," the older woman gushed. "We've all been curious about Mr. Caldwell's mysterious house guest." Forrest winced at her phrasing but said nothing as Mrs. Patterson led Nora toward the dry goods section. He browsed the tool section, pretending not to notice the speculative glances cast their way by the other customers. News traveled fast in small communities, and Nora's presence at his homestead had undoubtedly been the subject of gossip. An hour later, Nora emerged from the back room where Mrs. Patterson kept a selection of ready-made clothing. She wore a dress of deep blue calico with a modest lace collar, her hair arranged with more care than before. The transformation wasn't dramatic. The dress was practical rather than fashionable, but something about the way she carried herself made Forrest's breath catch. "Will this do?" she asked, smoothing the skirt self-consciously. "You look beautiful," he said honestly. Her eyes widened slightly at his directness, then softened. "Thank you." Forrest paid for the dress over Nora's protests. Along with a few other items, she'd selected a hairbrush, some hairpins, and a small bottle of lavender water. He also settled his monthly account and ordered supplies to be delivered to the homestead the following week. The hotel dining room was relatively quiet when they arrived. The Saturday stage had already come and gone, leaving only a few travelers and local residents enjoying the hotel's offerings. The hostess seated them at a corner table with a view of the street. "This is lovely," Nora said, looking around at the modest but clean establishment. "I haven't been anywhere like this since." She trailed off, her expression clouding briefly before she visibly pushed the memory away. "Well, it's been some time. It's not fancy," Forrest said apologetically, "but the food's good." They ordered steaks, potatoes, and apple pie for dessert. As they ate, Forrest found himself telling Nora things he rarely shared about his childhood in Missouri, his 3 sisters who had all married and moved to California, his father's failing health that had prompted Forrest to seek his fortune in the West. "You write to them, your family?" Nora asked. "Christmas and birthdays," he admitted. "Ma writes more often, sends news about the girls and their children." "You have nieces and nephews you've never met," Forrest nodded, a pang of something like regret passing through him. 5 now, I think, maybe 6. "My sister Alina was expecting again when Ma wrote last fall." "Don't you miss them?" Nora asked softly. The question caught him off guard. "I suppose I do," he said slowly. "But this is the life I chose. Can't have everything." Nora nodded thoughtfully. "I understand that. After James died, I realized how much I'd given up to follow him. My teaching career, friendships, the chance for—" She hesitated. "For children of my own. James always said there would be time later after his commission ended." The sadness in her voice made Forrest reach across the table impulsively, covering her hand with his own. "I'm sorry," he said simply. She turned her hand to clasp his briefly, then withdrew it. "Life rarely goes as planned, does it?" Before Forrest could respond, a shadow fell across their table. "Well, if it isn't Caldwell," said a deep voice, "and with a lady friend no less." Forrest looked up to see Sheriff Wade Miller standing beside their table, thumbs hooked in his belt. The lawman was a decent sort, as far as Forrest knew, though they'd had little interaction beyond occasional nods in passing. "Sheriff," Forrest acknowledged, nodding toward his companion. "This is Mrs. Nora Flanagan." "Nora, Sheriff Miller." Miller tipped his hat respectfully. "Madam." "Welcome to River Crossing." "Thank you," Nora replied politely. "Mrs. Flanagan is staying at my place while she recovers from illness," Forrest explained, aware of how the situation might appear to others. "Her husband was an officer at Fort Shaw, killed in the line of duty." Understanding crossed the sheriff's face. "Captain Flanagan, I heard about that nasty business with those Blackfoot raiders. My condolences, madam." "Thank you," Nora said again, her expression carefully composed. Miller turned back to Forrest. "Just wanted to give you a heads up. There have been reports of cattle rustlers working this area. Hit the Peterson place 2 nights ago. Took nearly 20 head." Forrest frowned. "Appreciate the warning. I'll keep an eye out." "Do that," Miller said, "and maybe consider riding with the others for the roundup next month." "Safety in numbers," he He tipped his hat again. "Madam Caldwell." As the sheriff moved away, Nora looked at Forrest with concern. "Is that common, rustling?" "Common enough," Forrest admitted. "Usually it's worse during hard times. Last winter was mild, though, so I'm surprised they're starting this early in the season." The pleasant mood of their dinner had been dampened by the sheriff's news. They finished their meal in relative silence, both lost in thought. The sun was setting as they started the journey home, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Nora sat closer to Forrest than she had on the trip into town, whether from the cooling evening air or the unsettling news about rustlers. He couldn't be sure. "Thank you for today," she said as the lights of River Crossing disappeared behind them. It was wonderful to feel normal again. Forrest glanced at her profile, softened in the fading light. "You're welcome," he said. After a moment's hesitation, he added, "I enjoyed it too." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the steady clop of hooves and the creak of the wagon. Stars appeared overhead, brilliant against the darkening sky. "I should start looking for work," Nora said suddenly. "I can't keep living off your charity forever." Forrest tightened his grip on the reins. He'd known this conversation was inevitable, but that didn't make it any easier. "There's no rush," he said carefully. "You're still regaining your strength. I'm perfectly well now, and you know it." Her voice was gentle but firm. "You've been more than generous, Forrest, but I need to make my own way." He wanted to tell her she could stay, that her presence had transformed his solitary existence into something warmer, more meaningful. But what right did he have to ask that of her? She was young, educated, capable of building a new life, perhaps even finding love again someday. His isolated homestead was no place for a woman like her. "River Crossing School only runs during winter months," he said instead, "but Fort Benton might have opportunities. Or you could still try Helena." "Yes," she agreed softly. "I should inquire about positions in Fort Benton. It's closer." The rest of the journey passed in silence, the comfortable mood of earlier replaced by an unspoken tension. When they arrived at the homestead, Forrest helped Nora down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "I'll check the livestock before turning in," he said, stepping back. "Don't wait up." Nora nodded, watching as he led the horses toward the barn. In the moonlight, her expression was unreadable. The following week brought unseasonably heavy rain, keeping both Forrest and Nora largely confined to the cabin. The forced proximity only heightened the tension between them. Forrest spent as much time as possible in the barn, making unnecessary repairs and reorganizing tools that were already in perfect order. Nora, for her part, threw herself into domestic tasks with almost frantic energy. She scrubbed the cabin from top to bottom, mended every article of clothing they owned, and baked enough bread to feed an army. They were like two planets locked in orbit, neither able to break free nor draw closer without risking catastrophe. On the fourth day of rain, Forrest returned from the barn to find Nora standing at the window, staring out at the gray landscape. Something in her posture, a certain vulnerability in the curve of her shoulders, made his chest tighten. "Everything all right?" he asked, hanging his wet coat by the door. She turned, and he was startled to see tears in her eyes. "I wrote a letter to the school board in Fort Benton," she said, "asking about teaching positions." Forrest nodded slowly, unsure why this would cause her distress. "That's good practical." "Is it?" She took a deep breath. "I've been trying to convince myself it's the right thing to do, the sensible choice. Move on, build a new life, be independent." "Isn't that what you want?" he asked carefully. Nora looked at him directly, a new resolve in her gaze. "What I want," she said slowly, "is to stop feeling like I'm intruding in your life. What I want is to know if you see me as more than just an obligation, a charity case you took in because you're a good man who couldn't leave a woman to die on the trail." The directness of her question left Forrest momentarily speechless. In the silence, Nora's expression began to crumple. "I see," she said quietly, turning back toward the window. "I've made a fool of myself. Please forget I said anything. Nora." Forrest crossed the room in 3 strides, gently turning her to face him. "You're not an obligation, you never were. Then what am I to you? Her voice was barely above a whisper. Forrest struggled to find the right words. He'd spent years alone, deliberately avoiding entanglements, protecting himself from the vulnerability that came with caring too deeply. But Nora had slipped past his defenses without even trying. He swallowed hard. You're the reason I look forward to coming back to this cabin each day. You're the first person I want to tell when something good happens or when something troubles me. You've made this place a home instead of just somewhere I sleep. Tears spilled over onto Nora's cheeks. Why didn't you say anything? Because you deserve better than a rough homesteader with calloused hands and limited prospects. He reached up to brush a tear from her face, his touch feather light. Because you're still grieving your husband, because I was afraid you'd leave anyway. James has been gone for nearly a year, she said softly. I'll always honor his memory, but I'm not living in the past, and as for deserving better. She placed her hand over his, holding it against her cheek. I've never met a better man than you, Forrest Caldwell. The last of his resistance crumbled. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Forrest lowered his head and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, tentative, a question rather than a demand. Nora answered by stepping closer, her hands coming to rest on his chest as she returned the kiss with a warmth that sent his pulse racing. When they finally separated, both a little breathless, Forrest rested his forehead against hers. Stay, he said simply, not as a guest or a charity case. Stay because you want to, because we could build something good here together. Nora's smile was radiant through her tears. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll stay. The rain finally stopped the next morning, as if nature itself approved of their decision. Stepping onto the porch together, they found the world washed clean, the prairie stretching before them in a tapestry of greens and golds beneath a sky of perfect blue. Forrest slipped his arm around Nora's waist, still marveling at the simple pleasure of being able to touch her freely. What would you like to do today? He asked. She leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. I thought I might plant a vegetable garden on the south side of the cabin. It gets good sun there. Planning to stick around for the harvest, are you? He teased gently. Nora looked up at him, her eyes clear and certain. I'm planning to stick around for many harvests to come, Mr. Caldwell, if you'll have me. Forrest's heart swelled with a joy he'd nearly forgotten was possible. I think that can be arranged, Mrs. Flanagan. The following weeks passed in a haze of shared work and newfound intimacy. They established new routines, discovered each other's habits and preferences, and navigated the occasional disagreement with growing skill. Nora's garden took shape, with neat rows of carrots, beans, potatoes, and tomatoes promising summer bounty. Forrest expanded the chicken coop and added a milk cow to their small collection of livestock. In the evenings, they sat on the porch swing Forrest had built, watching the sunset and making plans. Sometimes they spoke of practical matters, improvements to the homestead, preparations for winter, the possibility of expanding the herd. Other times, their conversations turned to more personal hopes, a proper wedding in the fall, perhaps children someday. Do you think your family would approve of me? Nora asked one evening, her head resting on Forrest's shoulder as they watched fireflies rising from the tall grass. They'd adore you, he assured her. Ma's been pestering me to find a wife for years. She'd probably weep with joy. I'd like to meet them someday, Forrest nodded thoughtfully. Maybe next spring we could make the journey to Missouri or invite them here once we've fixed up the place a bit more. The casual mention of a shared future still gave Nora a flutter of happiness. After James's death, she'd believed such possibilities were closed to her forever. Finding love again, especially with a man as good and steady as Forrest, felt like a miracle she could scarcely believe. June rolled into July, bringing scorching days and the occasional violent thunderstorm. Forrest joined neighboring ranchers for a cattle drive to Fort Benton, leaving Nora alone at the homestead for 3 anxious days. His return, dusty and exhausted but safe, was celebrated with a special dinner and a night of lovemaking that left them both breathless and more deeply connected than ever. It was during breakfast the next morning that Forrest brought up the subject they'd been circling for weeks. I was thinking, he said, watching Nora pour coffee with a domesticity that still amazed him, maybe we should make things official. She looked up, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Are you asking me to marry you, Forrest Caldwell? He set down his fork, suddenly serious. I am. I know it hasn't been long, but I'm sure about this. About us. I love you, Nora. Will you be my wife? Nora's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. Yes, she said simply. Nothing would make me happier. Forrest reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused thumb brushing over her knuckles. We could ride into river crossing this weekend, see if the circuit preacher's in town. If not, we'll have to wait until next month. I don't mind waiting, Nora assured him. Though I admit, I'm eager to be Mrs. Caldwell. The sound of her future name on her lips sent a thrill through Forrest. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. So am I. Their plans were interrupted 2 days later by the arrival of unexpected visitors. Forrest was mending tack in the barn when Rusty's sudden barking alerted him to approaching riders. Setting aside his work, he stepped outside to see 2 men on horseback approaching the cabin. Nora had also heard the commotion and stood on the porch, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. Forrest moved quickly to join her, his hand instinctively checking for the revolver he kept at his hip when working outdoors. As the riders drew closer, Forrest recognized Sheriff Miller and another man he didn't know, tall and lean, with the straight-backed posture of military training. Afternoon, Caldwell, Miller called as they reined in their horses in front of the cabin. Hope we're not interrupting. Not at all, Sheriff, Forrest replied cautiously. What brings you out this way? Miller gestured to his companion. This is Lieutenant Graham from Fort Benton. He's looking for Mrs. Flanagan. Nora stepped forward, her face pale. I'm Nora Flanagan, she said. Is something wrong? The lieutenant dismounted, removing his hat respectfully. Mrs. Flanagan, I'm Lieutenant Robert Graham. I served with your husband at Fort Shaw before his death. Yes, I remember you, Nora said. You came to the funeral. Graham nodded. I've been trying to locate you for some time. When Captain Reynolds took command, he was less than thorough in handling certain matters. It was only recently that I discovered your husband's personal effects and final pay had never been forwarded to you. Nora's hand found Forrest's arm, gripping it tightly. I see, she said carefully. There's also the matter of your widow's pension, Graham continued. It should have been arranged immediately, but the paperwork was misplaced. I've taken the liberty of filing it properly. There's a substantial sum owed to you, backdated to Captain Flanagan's death. Forrest felt Nora sway slightly beside him. He slipped an arm around her waist to steady her. Why don't you gentlemen come inside? He suggested. It's too hot to discuss business in the yard. Over coffee at the kitchen table, Lieutenant Graham explained the situation more fully. James Flanagan had not only been owed back pay, but had also taken out a substantial life insurance policy through the Army. Between that, his personal effects, including several items of value, and the widow's pension, Nora was entitled to a considerable sum enough to purchase her own property and live comfortably for years, if managed wisely. The funds have been deposited at the bank in Fort Benton, Graham explained, sliding a document across the table for Nora to sign. This acknowledges receipt of the information. You'll need to visit the bank in person to make arrangements for the money. Nora signed the paper mechanically, her expression unreadable. Thank you for your efforts, Lieutenant. It was very kind of you to track me down. It was the least I could do, Graham replied. Captain Flanagan was a good officer and a friend. After the sheriff and lieutenant departed, promising to see themselves out, a heavy silence fell over the cabin. Forrest watched Nora carefully, uncertain of what this development meant for their plans. Well, he said finally, when the silence became unbearable, that's quite a change in your circumstances. Nora looked up from the documents Graham had left, her eyes troubled. Yes, it is. You're a wealthy woman now, Forrest continued, trying to keep his tone light despite the fear gripping his heart. No need to marry a dirt-poor rancher when you could buy your own place, maybe even go back east if you wanted. Is that what you think I'll do? She asked quietly. Leave now that I have options, Forrest shrugged, looking away. Would be the sensible thing. You're young, educated, and now financially independent. The world's open to you. Nora stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. For a moment, Forrest thought she might walk out, confirming his worst fears. Instead, she circled the table and knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. "Forrest Caldwell, you are the most infuriating man I have ever met," she said, her voice fierce despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "Do you really think I would leave you over money? Do you think so little of what we've built here? I think," he said carefully, "that you deserve choices. Real choices, not just accepting me because I was the only port in a storm." "You were never that," she insisted. "From the moment I opened my eyes in this cabin, you have shown me nothing but kindness, respect, and eventually, love. Those are the things I choose, Forrest, not money or property or status." He searched her face, looking for any sign of doubt or hesitation. Finding none, he pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she might disappear if he let go. "I'm sorry," he murmured against her hair. I couldn't bear it if you stayed out of obligation." Nora pulled back enough to look into his eyes. "The only obligation I feel is to my own heart," she said, "and it belongs entirely to you." The tension that had gripped Forrest since the arrival of their visitors finally released. He kissed her deeply, pouring all his relief and love into the gesture. When they finally separated, Nora smiled mischievously. "Besides," she said, "think of what we could do with that money. Expand the ranch, build a bigger house, maybe even hire help during roundup season." Forrest raised an eyebrow. "Of course we," she said firmly. "I may be bringing the funds to this partnership, but you're bringing years of knowledge and hard work. This is our future, Forrest, together." The following Saturday, they rode into River Crossing to discover the circuit preacher was indeed in town, with Sheriff Miller and Mrs. Patterson as witnesses. Forrest and Nora were married in the small church at the edge of town. Nora wore her blue calico dress with wildflowers in her hair. Forrest donned his good shirt and a new pair of trousers purchased for the occasion. The ceremony was simple, the words ancient and powerful. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Forrest kissed his bride with a reverence that brought tears to Mrs. Patterson's eyes. That evening, back at the homestead, their homestead now, they sat on the porch swing, watching night fall over the land that had brought them together. "Happy, Mrs. Caldwell?" Forrest asked, savoring the sound of her new name. Nora leaned against him, her head fitting perfectly in the crook of his shoulder. "Completely," she said. "And you, Mr. Caldwell, never thought I could be this happy," he admitted. "Didn't think it was in the cards for me." She took his hand, threading her fingers through his. "Life rarely goes as planned," she said, echoing her words from weeks before. "Sometimes it turns out better." Forrest pulled her closer, marveling at how this woman who had quite literally collapsed at his barn that fateful evening in April had transformed his solitary existence into something rich with possibility. "Much better," he agreed. 5 years later, Forrest stood on the porch of their expanded homestead, watching as the stagecoach from Fort Benton rumbled up the newly improved road. Beside him, Nora bounced their 8-month-old daughter, Beatrice, on her hip, while their 3-year-old son, Benjamin, pressed against his father's leg in shy anticipation. "They're here," Nora said excitedly. "Your mother actually came. I can hardly believe it." Forrest grinned, placing a hand on Benjamin's dark curls. "Told you she wouldn't miss seeing her grandchildren for anything." The coach came to a stop in front of the house, and the driver helped an elderly woman with Forrest's same blue eyes descend carefully. Behind her came 2 younger women, Forrest's sisters, Eleanor and Margaret, along with Eleanor's husband and their 2 children. "Forrest," his mother called, her face lighting up at the sight of him. "Oh, my boy," he strode forward to embrace her, then turned to introduce his family properly. "Ma, this is Nora, my wife, and these are your grandchildren, Benjamin and Beatrice," Margaret squealed with delight. "They're even more beautiful than your letters described. Look at those curls." Benjamin hid his face against Nora's skirt, but Beatrice beamed at the newcomers, revealing 2 tiny teeth in a gummy smile. "Come inside," Nora invited warmly. "The journey must have been exhausting. We have refreshments ready and dinner will be on the table shortly." As the family moved toward the house, a spacious two-story structure that had replaced the original cabin last year, Forrest lingered a moment, taking in the scene. The homestead had grown significantly in 5 years. The barn was larger, the corrals more extensive. A bunkhouse stood to the west, housing the 3 ranch hands they employed during busy seasons. The cattle herd numbered over 200 head now, and a small orchard was beginning to take shape behind the house. But the true wealth of the place, Forrest knew, wasn't in the improvements or the growing herd or even the comfortable bank account they maintained in Fort Benton. It was in the laughter that now filled the house, the tiny footprints in the garden soil, the knowledge that he was no longer alone. Nora reappeared on the porch, having handed the children off to their adoring grandmother and aunts. She slipped her arm around his waist, following his gaze across their property. "Quite a change from when I first stumbled onto your land," she observed. "Best thing that ever happened to me," Forrest said, pulling her close. "You collapsing at my barn," Nora laughed, the sound still as sweet to his ears as it had been the first time he heard it. "Not my most dignified moment." "Maybe not," he agreed, "but it led to everything good in my life." From inside came the sound of Benjamin's delighted giggle as one of his aunts evidently coaxed him out of his shyness. Beatrice's happy babbling joined the chorus of family voices. "We should go in," Nora said. "Your mother will want to hear all about the ranch's expansion." Forrest nodded but held her a moment longer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I love you," he said simply. "Every day I thank God for bringing you to me." Nora turned in his arms, rising on tiptoe to kiss him properly. "And I love you, Forrest Caldwell, through all the seasons to come." Hand in hand, they walked into the house, into the warmth of family, and the future they had built together, a future that had begun on a stormy spring evening when a desperate widow collapsed at his barn, and his kind offer of shelter turned into love.